Hello, everybody. This is Jim Ransom with another edition of Morning Jim Poetry. This is the first week in March, and all sorts of things are going to happen this month. Various birthdays, daylight savings time is going to come back. A mixed blessing, I'll tell you. And so the old world is beginning to tell us that it's time for spring. At least that's the early message I'm getting. And I thought it might be nice to read some Emily Dickinson poems, selected poems from Emily Dickinson. I've had this book for a long time. And Emily Dickinson is considered to be at least one of the two best poets of the 19th century. And who's the other one? It's arguable. But at least Emily Dickinson, who started and ended her life as a spinster, living in the family home in Amherst, Massachusetts, turns out that it wasn't until after she died that people began to realize that she was a really good poet. The story there is really very interesting, and I'll touch on a little of it as we go along here. But Emily Dickinson was a well-educated young woman from she was one of three children of a lawyer in Amherst, whose grandfather was quite well known, as was her father. The grandfather had gone bankrupt sometime after he started Amherst College, but that's another story entirely. Emily was mostly educated at Amherst Academy from ages 10 through 17, and this was mostly a mixed sex school. Both boys and girls went to it. And she then began to attend Mount Holyoke Female Cemetery. And she dropped out of that in less than a year because she just couldn't tolerate it. Maybe she liked being around boys more than she was willing to admit. I have no idea. But from then on, she lived at home, where she spent most of her time writing poems, but also had an extensive correspondence. She didn't really go out and meet people very much. She did some, but primarily she, over the years, developed an extensive and detailed correspondence with both male and female correspondence of one kind or another. And during this time, she was writing what amounted to thousands of poems that she stitched together in little booklets. This was discovered by her sister Lavinia after Emily had died. She only had about, I've seen the numbers, 7 to 10 poems published in her lifetime. Why that was is complicated. I don't even understand most of it, but I think a lot of it was the fact that she and her friends really didn't think about turning them in for publication. During the Civil War, she wrote at least 900 poems during that time, and they weren't directly about the Civil War, although some of them began to reflect concerns about death and dying that hadn't shown up so much in her earlier poems. But let's go ahead and start reading. I'm going to read from the front to the back of this book. And Not all the poems by any means, but I want to hit on some of the poems that I think are of most interest to me, and I hope to you too. One more thing about Emily's poems. Almost none of them were ever titled, at least not by her. She just wrote them, and the title has mostly been the first lines of the poems. But then officious people like her sister and her first publisher got busy and put names on some of these poems that were their names, not Emily's original names. They were unnamed by her. So this one is one of the untitled ones. It's called Wild Nights. Wild nights, were I with thee, wild nights should be our luxury. Futile the winds to a heart in port. Done with the compass, done with a chart. Rowing in Eden, the sea. Might I but moor tonight in thee. Now that's really a lyric poem, isn't it? A love poem, you might say. We don't know to whom it was written, but we can see what it is. The next one was written close to the same time, and it's one of the titled ones, probably by the later publisher. It's called Hope. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. And sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm that could abash the little bird that kept so many warm. I've heard it in the chillest land and on the strangest sea, yet never in extremity it asked a crumb of me. You can see from those poems that she could be considered a lyric poet without much doubt. Moving on, I'm coming to another one here that is named again by the publisher, Farewell. Tie the strings to my life, my lord, then I am ready to go. Just look at the horses, rapid, that will do. Put me in on the firmest side, so I shall never fall. For we must ride to the judgment, and it's partly downhill. But never I mind the bridges, and never I mind the sea, held fast in everlasting race by my own choice and thee. Goodbye to the life I used to live, and the world I used to know, and kiss the hills for me just once. Now I am ready to go. You can see from the way these poems are set up that they're not like the singy-song poems that were written by the mainly British poets of that era, nor like the Longfellow poems, and really not like any other poets that were existing in her time. And I think that we have to say that she was original, and we have to ask, well, why was she such an original poet in that era when there were so many poets writing? Well, one reason is she really didn't seem to know of or read the works of many other poets. And another was that she turned out, as her life progressed, to be what we'd have to call a recluse. Some of that started when she was taking care of her mother in the mother's last illness. And and she was depending on her sister Lavinia to do most of the domestic chores around the house and the shopping. And Emily seemed to like that kind of life. It gave her time to do her mental stuff. And the mental stuff was mostly writing poem after poem. And so she got more and more, let's say, distracted by, that's not probably a good word for it, but interested in all the surroundings of death. Let's read a poem along those lines right now. There's been a death in the opposite house as lately as today. I know it by the numb look such houses have always. The neighbors rustle in and out. The doctor drives away. A window opens like a pod, abrupt, mechanically. Somebody flings a mattress out. The children hurry by. They wonder if it died on that. I used to when a boy. The minister goes stiffly in as if the house were his, and he owned all the mourners now, and little boys besides. And then the milliner, and the man of the appalling trade, to take measure of the house. There'll be that dark parade of tassels and of coaches soon. It's easy as a sign. The intuition of the news is in just a country town. The appalling trade, of course, is the undertaker who's going to pick up the body. So she's watching this from across the street. At least that's the setup of the poem. Now here's another one. This was one of those that was written during the Civil War, about which she doesn't say much. She doesn't say the Civil War any place in her poems, but you can kind of tell which ones were written at that time. This one's called The Battlefield. And again, this title was added later on by her publisher, or maybe Lavinia, her sister. They dropped like flakes, they dropped like stars, like petals from a rose, when suddenly across the June a wind with fingers goes. They perished in the seamless grass. No eye could find the place, but God in his repealless list can summon every face. The word repealless is one word, and it means that from that list nothing can be repealed. Repealless list. And this was one of Emily's stylistic differences. She would make up the appropriate word for a place in her poems whenever that was needed. Let's read one more of these Civil War type poems, and then we'll let it go for the day. The first lesson. Not in this world to see his face sounds long, until I read the place where this is said to be, but just the primer to a life unopened, rare upon the shelf, clasped yet to him and me, and yet my primer suits me, so I would not choose a book to know then that, be sweeter wise, might someone else so learned be, and leave me just my ABC, himself could have the skies. Well, there are many other. Most of her poems were fairly short. And for those of us who are reading the poems, that's convenient. We can get in more poems. Her sister Lavinia had been requested by Emily to burn all of her correspondence after she died. And the correspondence was voluminous, many, many letters. And Lavinia did that, pretty much. She didn't get them all. But the poems were not mentioned, and so Lavinia saved them and eventually turned them over to a potential publisher. Most of her poems were untitled, but Lavinia and others added some names later after Emily's death, when publication was contemplated. And there was a lot of squabbling in the family and between the family and the publisher about what to do with some of these poems. The publisher wanted to edit them, and a lot of this was not good. So the squabbling was about the editing, and the people who didn't want to edit the poems and make standard poems out of them won, thank God. So we're left with more or less the originals that Emily wanted. That's it for today. I hope you enjoy the poetry, and maybe we'll read some more of Emily Dickinson at a later date. Bye now.